The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when I finally understood that I was truly alone. Not the kind of alone you feel in a crowded room, or the temporary solitude of a weekend by yourself. This was different. This was the kind of alone that settles into your bones like the cold itself, permanent and absolute. I'm standing at the window now, watching the forest disappear under fresh powder, and I can barely remember the woman who arrived here 6 months ago. She was someone else entirely, someone who still believed in second chances and happy endings, someone who thought people came back. They don't, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, or at least the beginning that matters. My name is Eleanor, and I came to this cabin in late spring when the world was still green and forgiving. I told myself it was temporary, a healing retreat, a chance to clear my head after everything fell apart. I had enough money saved to last a few months, maybe longer if I was careful. The cabin belonged to my late grandmother, tucked so far into the northern wilderness that the nearest town was a 3-hour drive on roads that barely deserved the name. I thought I'd stay a month, maybe 2. That was before I realised I had nowhere else to go. The drive up had been long and lonely. My entire life packed into the back of a truck that wasn't even mine anymore. Daniel had kept the SUV in the divorce. He'd kept a lot of things. The house, the dog we'd picked out together, most of our friends who somehow became his friends the moment we signed the papers. Isn't it funny how that works? How a life you spent a decade building can be dismantled in an afternoon, divided up like furniture, with you walking away with the pieces nobody wanted. I got the cabin, the one Daniel had always hated. Too remote, he'd said, too primitive. No cell service, no internet, barely any electricity. What would we even do there? I hadn't known the answer then. I did now. The first weeks were harder than I'd expected. The silence was overwhelming. I'd grown so accustomed to noise, the constant hum of civilization, traffic and voices, and the television always playing in the background. Here, there was nothing. Just wind in the trees and the occasional cry of a bird. At night, the quiet was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I spent those early days cleaning, organising, trying to make the cabin feel like home. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but my grandmother had loved it. I found her things still tucked away in drawers and closets, books with her notes in the margins, recipes written in her careful handwriting, a winter coat that still smelled faintly of her perfume. I cried when I found that coat, cried harder than I had in months, because my grandmother had been the only person who never made me feel like I needed to be someone different. She'd loved this place, this isolation, and she'd never apologised for it. When she died 2 years ago, she'd left the cabin to me specifically, not to Daniel and me. Just me, like she'd known I might need it someday. I wore her coat constantly those first weeks, even though it was too warm for it. I needed something that felt like being held. My phone still worked, technically. I could drive an hour down the mountain to where the cell signal started if I really needed to make a call. I did that twice in the beginning. The first time, I called my sister Sarah. She answered on the 4th ring, distracted and rushed. "Eleanor, hi. I can't really talk right now. The kids have soccer and I'm running late. I just wanted to check in," I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady. "See how everyone is." "We're good. Busy. You know how it is." "Are you still up at that cabin? When are you coming back?" "I don't know yet. I'm thinking I might stay a while longer." There'd been a pause. "Eleanor, you can't hide forever. You need to get back out there. Start moving on with your life." Moving on. As if it were that simple. As if I could just decide to be over it. "I'm not hiding," I'd said. "I'm healing." "Well, heal faster. Mum's worried about you. We all are. But not worried enough to visit. Not worried enough to drive up and see how I was really doing." Sarah had 3 kids and a husband and a full life that didn't have room for her broken older sister. I understood that. I did. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. The second call I'd made was to my best friend, Melissa. We'd known each other since college, been through everything together. Or so I'd thought. "Eleanor, oh my God, I've been meaning to call you," she'd said, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. "How are you? How's the wilderness treating you?" "It's quiet," I'd said. "Really Quiet. I bet. Listen, I wanted to tell you before you heard from someone else. Daniel's seeing someone. My stomach had dropped. Already? Yeah. Apparently they met at that work conference in March, before you guys even split. I didn't want to say anything, but I thought you should know. Before we split. Which meant he'd been cheating. Which meant our entire ending had been built on lies. Who is she? I'd asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Some analyst from the Boston office, young, 26, I think. I was 37, old enough to be replaced, apparently. We talked a little longer, but the conversation had felt hollow. When we hung up, I had sat in my truck on the side of the mountain road and watched the sun set through the trees. That's when I realised I didn't want to make any more calls. Didn't want to hear about Daniel's new life or my sister's busy schedule, or how everyone expected me to just bounce back like nothing had happened. I drove back to the cabin and didn't leave again. Summer passed slowly. I learned to be alone with myself, something I'd never really done before. I'd always been someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's girlfriend, someone's wife. I'd never just been Eleanor, by herself, for herself. It was terrifying at first. Without other people to define me, I didn't know who I was. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text someone about something I'd seen, then remember there was no one to text. I'd think of a joke and turn to share it with an empty room. But gradually, something shifted. I started talking to myself, narrating my days out loud just to hear a human voice. I'd describe what I was doing as I did it. Now, I'm making tea. Now, I'm reading on the porch. Now, I'm watching the sunset turn the lake gold. It felt crazy at first, but it helped. My own voice became a companion. I fell into rhythms. Morning walks before it got too hot. Afternoons spent reading or working in the small garden I'd planted. Evenings on the porch watching the day end. I learned which birds sang at dawn and which animals moved through the forest at dusk. I learned that loneliness and solitude weren't the same thing, that one was suffering and the other was a kind of peace. By the time autumn arrived, painting the woods in shades of amber and rust, I'd stopped counting the days, stopped waiting for my real life to begin again. This was my real life now, and I was surprised to find I didn't hate it. I should have known winter would be different. The first snow came in early October, unseasonably early. I woke to find the world transformed, everything soft and white and silent. It was beautiful, magical even. I stood on the porch in my grandmother's coat and felt something like joy, but the snow kept coming and coming. By mid-October, I had 3 feet on the ground and more falling every day. The temperature dropped. My supply runs to the small town became more difficult, the road increasingly treacherous. I started stocking up on everything I might need, filling the cabin with food and firewood and lamp oil. Just in case, I told myself. Just to be prepared. I made one last trip to town in late October. The woman at the general store, a weathered local named Margaret who'd known my grandmother, had looked concerned when I'd loaded up my truck with supplies. "You planning to stay up there all winter?" she'd asked. "I think so." "Is that a problem?" "Honey, that road becomes impassable once the real snow hits. You could be stuck up there for months." "I know. I'll be fine." She'd studied me for a long moment. "Your grandmother was a tough woman, spent every winter up there alone, but she grew up in this country, knew how to handle it. You sure you know what you're getting into?" I wasn't sure at all, but I'd nodded anyway. "I'll manage." "You got a radio, in case of emergency?" "No cell service works up there." "I know that. That's why I'm asking about a radio. Emergency band, in case you need help." I'd thought about it, then shook my head. "I'll be fine." Looking back now, I can see that moment for what it was. My last chance to admit I might need help. My last chance to stay connected to the world. But I'd been so determined to prove I could do this alone. To prove I didn't need anyone. Pride. That's what it was. And pride can kill you in the wilderness. The first real blizzard hit in early November. I woke to find my windows completely covered in snow. The world outside erased by white. The wind howled like something alive, battering the cabin with a fury I'd never experienced. I spent that entire day and night huddled by the fire, listening to the storm try to tear my shelter apart. When it finally passed, I'd been completely snowed in. The door wouldn't open against the drift. I had to dig my way out through a window, tunneling through snow that came up to my chest. It took hours. By the time I reached the truck, I found it buried under a mountain of white. Even if I could dig it out, the road was gone, invisible under countless feet of snow. I was trapped. That should have been when I panicked, when I realised the danger I'd put myself in. But instead, I'd felt a strange calm. Okay, I'd thought, this is it then. This is the test. I spent the next days establishing new routines for winter survival, checking the firewood supply, rationing food, melting snow for water, insulating the windows against the cold. My world shrank to the size of the cabin, and the small area around it I could keep clear. The silence deepened. No birds sang in the frozen forest. No animals moved through the snow. It was just me and the wind and the endless white. That's when I started the diary. I'd found it in one of my grandmother's trunks, a leather-bound journal with blank pages. I'd started writing in it every evening by lamplight, documenting my days. At first, it was practical, a record of supplies and weather, but gradually it became more. I started writing about my memories, my past, everything that had led me here. I wrote about Daniel, about the slow death of our marriage, so gradual I hadn't noticed until it was too late. How we'd stopped talking, really talking somewhere around year 7. How we'd become roommates instead of lovers, going through the motions of a life together while growing further apart with every passing day. I wrote about the night I'd found the emails, how I'd known before I even opened them, known with a sick certainty in my stomach, how reading his words to another woman had hurt worse than any physical pain, the casual intimacy of it, the way he'd shared his real thoughts and feelings with her, things he'd stopped sharing with me years ago. I wrote about the divorce, the lawyers and the mediators and the division of everything we'd built together, how he'd looked at me across the conference table like I was a stranger, like our decade together meant nothing, like I meant nothing. I wrote about my mother, who'd been disappointed when I'd chosen art history over something practical, who'd been relieved when I'd married Daniel, finally doing something right, who now called me weekly to ask when I was going to get my life together, as if I were a project that needed fixing. I wrote about all the friends who'd vanished the moment I wasn't fun anymore, the ones who'd stopped inviting me to things because my sadness made them uncomfortable, the ones who'd offered hollow support but never showed up when I actually needed them. I wrote about loneliness, the kind that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being surrounded by people who didn't really see you. And slowly, as I wrote, I began to understand something. I'd been waiting. For months, maybe years, I'd been waiting for someone to save me, waiting for Daniel to remember why he'd loved me, waiting for my family to really hear me, waiting for my friends to prove they cared, waiting for someone, anyone, to show up and make everything better. But no one was coming. December brought a cold so intense it felt personal, like the universe itself had turned hostile. The temperature dropped so low that the nails in the cabin walls contracted, making sharp popping sounds in the night. I wore layers upon layers, my grandmother's coat over sweaters over thermal underwear, and still shivered. I spent hours every day just maintaining, keeping the fire going, keeping the cold at bay. It was exhausting work, hauling wood from the shed I dug out in the yard, splitting logs with an axe I was still learning to use. My hands became rough and calloused. My muscles ached constantly. I was becoming someone else, someone harder and stronger and more capable than the woman who'd arrived in spring. But the hardest part wasn't the physical labour. It was the psychological weight of the isolation. Days would pass where I didn't speak out loud, where the only sound was the wind and the crackle of the fire. I'd find myself having conversations with people who weren't there, arguing with Daniel about things that no longer mattered, defending myself to my mother's imagined criticisms. I started leaving the cabin less and less. The cold was too brutal, the effort too much. I'd stand at the window and watch the forest, looking for any sign of movement, any break in the monotony of white. Sometimes I'd see a bird, a flash of darkness against the snow, and it would feel like a gift. One night, during a particularly vicious storm, the lamp ran out of oil. I sat in complete darkness, the fire my only light, and felt something break inside me. I'd been holding myself together through sheer will, but suddenly I couldn't anymore. I cried for hours, sobbing into my hands, letting out months of grief and fear and loneliness. When I finally stopped, exhausted and empty, something had changed. The tears had washed something away, some last hope I'd been clinging to. I saw my situation with brutal clarity. No one was coming for me, not Daniel, who was building a new life with someone younger and easier, not my family, who loved me in theory, but not enough to be inconvenienced, not my friends, who'd already moved on to other dramas and other concerns. If I was going to survive this winter, I had to do it alone. There was no rescue coming. There was just me. It should have been devastating. Instead, it was strangely liberating. I'd spent so much of my life waiting for other people's approval, other people's love, other people's validation. I'd shaped myself to fit their expectations, made myself smaller to make them comfortable. And where had it gotten me? Divorced, alone, frozen in the wilderness with nothing but my grandmother's old coat and a rapidly dwindling supply of firewood. But I was still here, still breathing, still surviving. That night, by the dying firelight, I made a decision. I stopped waiting, stopped hoping someone would remember me, would check on me, would care. I accepted that I was on my own and that this was okay. More than okay. It was a gift, actually. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free. Free from expectation, free from disappointment, free from the constant work of maintaining relationships with people who didn't really want me anyway. Free to be exactly who I was, without apology or explanation. It sounds dramatic, I know. Possibly delusional. But something fundamental shifted in me that night. I stopped being afraid of my aloneness and started accepting it, even embracing it. The next morning, I woke before dawn and started a new routine. I began talking to myself more deliberately, not just narrating my actions, but actually speaking to myself as if I were my own friend. I'd make tea and say, "Here, Eleanor, I made this for you." I'd finish a difficult task and say, "Good job. That was hard, and you did it." It sounds insane written out like this. Maybe it was, but it helped. I was learning to be my own companion, my own comfort. I was learning that I could rely on myself. I also started reading my grandmother's old journals, which I'd found in another trunk. She'd kept detailed records of her winters here, and I'd been avoiding them, not wanting to see how much better she'd handled it than me. But now I read them with new eyes. What I found surprised me. She'd struggled too. She'd been lonely. She'd had dark days and moments of doubt, but she'd persisted, found meaning in small things, built a life out here on her own terms. And she'd done it by choice, not because she was running from something, but because she genuinely preferred the solitude to the alternative. "The world asks us to be so many things," she'd written in one entry. "Wife, mother, daughter, friend, employee, citizen. We spend our whole lives trying to be enough for everyone else. But who are we when no one's watching? That's what the wilderness teaches you. It strips away all the roles and leaves just you, bare and honest." Reading those words, I felt like she was speaking directly to me across time. She understood. She'd been where I was, felt what I was feeling, and she'd survived it. More than survived, she'd thrived. I started following her routines, the ones she'd documented in her journals. Morning walks, even in the brutal cold, just to move my body and see the sunrise. Afternoon reading by the window where the light was best. Evening writing by the fire. Simple rituals that gave structure to the shapeless days. I also started paying more attention to the world around me, really looking at it instead of just trying to survive it. The way the morning light hit the snow, turning it gold and pink. The patterns frost made on the windows, delicate as lace. The sound of the wind through different types of trees, each with its own voice. There was beauty here, I realised. Not despite the harshness, but because of it. The winter was brutal, yes, but it was also honest. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It didn't promise warmth and deliver cold. It was exactly what it appeared to be. And there was something clean about that, something pure. Christmas came and went unmarked. I had no tree, no decorations, no presents, just another day of snow and cold and solitude. I thought about my family gathering without me, probably relieved they didn't have to deal with my sadness, and found I didn't care, or rather I cared less than I thought I would. I made myself a special dinner that night, using some of the preserved vegetables from my summer garden and a precious can of chicken. I ate by candlelight, savouring each bite, and toasted my grandmother with a small glass of whiskey I'd found in her cupboard. "To you," I said aloud, raising my glass to her photograph on the mantel, "for showing me the way." New Year's Eve was similar. I stayed up to mark the midnight hour, sitting by the fire with my journal. I thought about making resolutions, but couldn't think of any. What would I resolve to do? Survive? I was already doing that. Be happy? That seemed too ambitious. Let go? I was working on it. Instead, I wrote a list of things I'd learned, things the winter had taught me. The list was long, filling several pages, but a few things stood out. I'd learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I could split wood and haul water and keep a fire going through the darkest nights, that my body was capable of more than I'd given it credit for. I'd learned that loneliness was a choice, that you could be alone without being lonely if you learned to be good company for yourself. I'd learned that most of my life had been spent performing for an audience that wasn't even paying attention, and that once I stopped performing, I could finally start living. I'd learned that endings weren't always beginnings in disguise. Sometimes they were just endings, and that was okay. The divorce wasn't the start of a new chapter, it was the closing of an old one. There didn't have to be a lesson or a silver lining. Sometimes things just ended. And finally, I'd learned that no one was coming to save me. Not because people were cruel or uncaring, but because that's not how life works. We save ourselves or we don't, and I'd chosen to save myself. January brought the deepest snows yet. Blizzards rolled through with such frequency, I stopped trying to keep the paths clear. The world became a study in white, the horizon line between earth and sky disappearing until everything was one seamless blank page. My food supplies were running low. I'd rationed carefully, but there's only so much you can stretch finite resources. I calculated I had maybe 6 weeks left, 8 if I really stretched it. After that, I'd be in trouble. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt oddly calm. If the worst happened, if I ran out of food or the cold became too much or something else went wrong, at least I'd gone down fighting. At least I'd tried. And honestly, there were worse ways to die than in this beautiful, brutal place that I'd learned to love. But I wasn't planning to die. I was planning to survive. And to do that, I needed to supplement my supplies, which meant ice fishing. My grandmother's journals had detailed instructions for cutting through the lake ice and setting up a simple fishing rig. I'd thought she was crazy when I'd first read about it. Now, with hunger becoming a real possibility, her crazy made sense. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to try. The lake was a 15-minute walk from the cabin, and the cold was so intense that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But I bundled up in every layer I owned, grabbed the ice auger from the shed, and made my way down to the frozen water. The lake looked otherworldly, a vast expanse of white interrupted only by occasional snow-covered rocks and fallen trees. I walked out onto the ice carefully, testing each step, terrified it would crack beneath me. But my grandmother's notes had assured me it was safe once the ice reached a certain thickness, and we were well past that point. I drilled through the ice, a process that left me sweating despite the cold and took far longer than I'd anticipated. But eventually, I broke through, and dark water welled up through the hole like a secret revealed. I set up the simple line exactly as my grandmother had described, baited with some of my precious food, and waited, and waited. For hours I sat on that frozen lake, watching the hole in the ice, seeing nothing but my own reflection in the dark water. My body ached with cold. My fingers went numb even inside my gloves. I was about to give up, to pack it in and accept defeat, when the line jerked. I grabbed it instinctively, felt the weight and pull of something alive on the other end, and pure adrenaline shot through me. I pulled, hand over hand, fighting to keep my grip on the frozen line, and then there it was, a fish, silver and thrashing, emerging from the darkness into the blinding light of day. I almost cried with relief. I'd done it, caught food, bought myself more time. That night, I cooked the fish over the fire, and it was the most delicious thing I'd ever eaten. Not because of how it was prepared, but because I'd caught it myself, because it represented something more than food. It represented my ability to take care of myself, to survive not just by consuming what I'd brought with me, but by actively providing for myself. I went back to the lake every few days after that. Not every trip was successful, but enough that I could stretch my supplies significantly. And more than the food, the fishing gave me purpose, a reason to leave the cabin and engage with the world. February came, and with it, a slight warming. Not warmth exactly, the temperature was still well below zero, but less brutally cold than January had been. The sun stayed in the sky a little longer each day. The light through the windows changed, becoming richer, more golden. I started to believe I might actually make it, that I might survive this winter not just physically, but emotionally intact. Maybe even better than intact. Maybe transformed. But winter wasn't done testing me yet. The storm that hit in mid-February was unlike anything I'd experienced. It came without warning, the sky going from grey to black in a matter of minutes. The wind rose to a howl that shook the entire cabin. Snow fell so thick I couldn't see the tree line just 50 feet away. I spent 2 days trapped inside, unable to even open the door against the wind and drifting snow. The fire was my entire world, and I fed it constantly, terrified of letting it go out. I went through my carefully rationed firewood faster than I'd planned, but there was no choice. If the fire died, I died. On the second night, something hit the cabin, a loud crash that made the whole structure shudder. I had no idea what it was, couldn't risk going outside to check. I sat by the fire and waited for the roof to cave in or the walls to collapse, waited for the wild to finally defeat me. But the cabin held. My grandmother had built it well, or maybe she'd been watching over me. Either way, I survived the night. When the storm finally passed and I could dig my way out, I found a massive tree had fallen, missing the cabin by inches. If it had hit just a little differently, I would have been crushed or trapped or exposed to the elements. I stood looking at it, this tree that had stood for probably 100 years, brought down by one night of wind, and understood how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all be taken away. That tree became a project. I spent weeks cutting it up for firewood, a job that was far beyond my skill level but necessary. Every piece I cut was wood I could burn, days I could survive. The work was grueling, my muscles screaming, my hands blistering despite gloves, but I kept at it day after day, sawing and splitting and stacking. And somewhere in that endless labour, something else happened. I stopped thinking about the past, stopped replaying every conversation with Daniel, every moment where our marriage had started to crack, stopped composing speeches to people who would never hear them, stopped waiting for an apology or an explanation or closure that was never coming. I became present, fully, completely present, in my body, in the moment, in this life I was living right now. The past couldn't be changed, the future couldn't be predicted, but right now, in this moment, I was alive. I was here. I was enough. March arrived like a promise. The storms became less frequent, the sun stronger, the snow started to melt just a little, creating a crust on the surface that sparkled like diamond dust. I began to hear birds again, their songs tentative at first, then growing bolder as the light increased. I made a calendar and crossed off the days, realizing with surprise that I'd been here almost a year, that I'd survived an entire winter alone in the wilderness, that I'd become the kind of person who could do that. My food supplies were nearly gone, but it didn't matter anymore. The road would be passable soon. I could leave if I wanted to. return to civilization, to my old life, to the world of other people. But did I want to? I sat with that question for days, writing about it in my journal, examining it from every angle. What was waiting for me out there? A life I'd already left behind, people who hadn't come looking for me, a world that felt increasingly foreign. Here I had peace. Here I knew exactly who I was. Here I didn't have to perform or explain or justify my existence. Here I was enough, just as I was. The night I made my decision, I stood outside under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled light across the darkness. The aurora borealis danced overhead, green and purple ribbons that seemed almost close enough to touch. I'd seen it a few times over the winter, but tonight it felt like a sign, a blessing on the choice I was making. I was staying. Not forever, maybe, but for now, for however long it felt right. I'd survived the winter, I'd learned to be alone without being lonely. I'd discovered that I didn't need anyone to come back for me, because I'd come back for myself. In the morning, I took out my journal and began to write, not about what had happened, but about what was happening now, about the woman I'd become, about the life I was choosing, about the peace I'd found in the frozen wilderness, far from everything I'd once known. The entry began with a simple sentence, one that felt both like an ending and a beginning. The night I realized no one was coming back for me, I discovered I didn't need them to. And it was true, all of it. The winter had stripped away everything I'd thought I needed, everything I'd thought defined me, and left me with just myself, bare and honest and real. And I'd learned that just myself was enough, more than enough. Spring will come, the snow will melt, the forest will turn green again, and I'll still be here, in my grandmother's cabin, living a life that makes sense to me even if it makes no sense to anyone else. Because the truth I learned in that long, dark winter is this: we're all alone in the end. Not in a tragic way, but in a fundamental way. We come into this world alone and we leave it alone, and in between, we're responsible for our own happiness, our own peace, our own survival. Other people can walk beside us for a while, can offer comfort and companionship, but they can't save us. Only we can do that. And once you truly accept that, once you stop waiting for rescue and start rescuing yourself, everything changes. The loneliness transforms into solitude. The isolation becomes freedom. The silence turns into peace. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll stay here forever, becoming like my grandmother, a woman who chose the wilderness over the world. Maybe I'll eventually return to civilization, bringing this new version of myself back into that old life. Maybe something else entirely will happen, something I can't imagine yet. But whatever comes, I'll face it alone. Not because I have to, but because I've learned I can. Because I've learned that my own company is enough. Because I've learned that the love I'd been seeking from everyone else was available all along, waiting inside myself to be discovered. The night I realized no one was coming back for me, I finally came back for myself, and that has made all the difference.